back to the Panthers and back to talking with Mike Kay, covers the Carolina Panthers for the Charlotte Observer. He joins us on the Heister Automotive Group hotline. You made it through another preseason, Mike. You're rewarded with covering the 53-man roster cut down. Happy.
Yeah, all I got was this turtleneck, or this V-neck. Oh man, it's been a long summer. I can't even. Their time doesn't even make sense anymore. But thank you for having me.
So, all right, let's start with the most overblown, in your opinion, the most overblown storyline of this Panthers preseason.
Wow. There's so many. Ike Ekwonu has had some very, very rough moments. Overall, I wouldn't say I'm concerned. He kind of looks like what he did last year, only they were able to mask a lot of the pass protection issues because they ran the ball so frequently. Any offensive lineman will tell you when you run the ball consistently, they're able to find a rhythm. When you're getting 2 or 3 series and most of it's pass sets, it's very hard to find that rhythm. I think for him, the next step in his development is improving as a pass protector from a technique standpoint. It's like he's using his natural ability to block, and sometimes that can cause problems. I remember when he was a prospect and I was in Philly, I viewed him as a guy who had Jason Peters-like traits. Now, that's not what I would say he is, but I think that's his upside if he really puts it all together. He's an incredible run blocker. They just need to kind of put everything together.
Mike Kay, Charlotte Observer, joining us here on the Heister Automotive Group hotline. All right, preseason's over. I like that first quarter in the Detroit game, Mike. That's kind of what I was looking for. What were some things that stood out from you from that first quarter?
Well, they passed the ball down the field, which is something that it almost felt like Bryce Young throughout training camp and throughout the preseason. The first 2 games was coached to take the underneath route because they didn't want to expose his playmaking ability. And it kind of seemed to work in a negative fashion. They allowed him to kind of do what he does. In this past game, there were crossing routes, there were post routes, there were go routes. Like, they allowed him to throw the ball beyond 15 yards. And I think that's where he can be very successful. He has a very subtly impressive arm, and he's able to kind of maneuver around the pocket. We saw on 2 separate runs back to back that he has that one cut ability that a lot of running backs wish they had. And I think his understanding of the pocket, his ability to see downfield, even at his size, we've talked about the last time I was on here, for a 5'10" guy, his ability to see the field is incredible. Mm-hmm. And his ability to process is very, very good. So I think what they just allowed Bryce to do is be Bryce. I think when you're sometimes trying to hide the specialness, that in turn can really downgrade the play of a player who can be special.
Mike Kay joining us. Charlotte Observer, covers the Panthers. Check out the podcast, Processing Blue. Everybody has a podcast these days, man. It's wild. I found that out. You know, there's 4.1 million registered podcasts right now.
I didn't know that, but now I do, and my life is better for it.
Yeah, a little fun fact for you. Speaking of processing, I guess that's the thing that everybody has talked about with Bryce Young. They love the way he processes the game. We played a clip from Hayden Hurst that came out of the Panthers Camp Confidential, where he was just kind of like in awe talking to a Jets defenseman about all the things that he can do. And I am curious, and Joe and I have gotten into this debate a couple times this preseason about Frank Reich being an old school guy and the idea of not showing too much versus, well, this is who Frank Reich is, and that specialness might not be on display just yet. How do you kind of view what we've seen so far in kind of showing what Bryce Young is capable of because of not wanting to put too much on tape versus this is just how Frank Reich is?
Well, I think he's kind of like an old school baseball manager, right? Where that 1 through 4 hitter is not really going to change. He's a guy who believes in righty versus lefty. He's a guy who follows the basics of the game. He's a quarterback from the 80s, right? Like, so I think you're seeing a little bit of that. I think you bring in Thomas Brown to kind of infuse that new school, so to speak, vibe. And I think you saw that later in preseason games when he was calling plays. And so I think it's about marrying those two things. But yeah, I agree with you. I think there's some gamesmanship within the Doug Peterson, Frank Reich, Nick Sirianni tree that is I don't want to say confusing because I feel like we've moved beyond that as a league in general and as an audience, right? And so it's kind of like you're doing gamesmanship for the sake of gamesmanship. And I agree with you guys. Like, I think that it's almost like tempering expectations because you're not showing anything, but you're literally not showing anything. And I think that that's kind of bit them the first 2 games. It's almost like they came to the realization like, hey, this is not productive for anyone if we are doing this. And then the 3rd game, they kind of let loose.
It occurred to me, Mike, watching some of the mixtape highlights of Anthony Richardson on the social medias and seeing his name kind of pop up on some fantasy league draft boards. It occurred to me from a conversation that we had during the coaching search where you said Shane Steichen, Eagles, assistant, he's going to be a guy that the Panthers talk to. So it occurred to me watching the game, actually, the Detroit game, which I watched Saturday morning on the DVR. I was like, you know what? The Panthers had a fork in the road. They could have went Young in Steichen. They could have went risky in AR, but they didn't. They went safe. They took the 62-year-old coach. They took the quarterback who probably fits more of the mold from the 80s as well. And I think both could be successful. But I think it's fascinating, Mike, to track which way the Colts go with that young and risky and which way the Panthers go with the kind of safe. Do you see it that same way?
Yeah, I do. And I think what's interesting about that, I brought up the Doug Peterson, Frank Reich, Nick Sirianni tree. Shane Steichen's somewhat a part of that. He coached under Frank when Frank was an OC with the Chargers. Obviously, then Frank's number 1 mentee, Nick Sirianni, gets the Eagles job. He immediately hires Shane Steichen. So there's a lot of like cross-pollination in this scenario too. And I would say, just thinking about it as you bring it up, Matt Rule, right? Matt Rule, like typically when you fire a coach or something doesn't work out, especially as a new owner, you immediately go to the opposite. And so I think Frank was the safe choice. I agree. I don't even know if he was look, some people would call him the boring choice. But I think what they needed was a sure thing. They needed to start putting together wins. I also think it's kind of misguided to be like, yeah, Frank Reich's going to lead to immediate wins. He never won a division title when he was in the AFC South, which was largely considered the worst division in football the entire time he was there. So I think Frank kind of got the rough end of the deal when he had a GM in Chris Ballard, who a lot of people think is way too hesitant with roster moves, and some would say scared. I think Frank's got a better opportunity here because of how collaborative Scott Fitterer is. And I think the collaboration of everybody really is what sold them on Frank. I think Shane's a guy who is kind of feeling out the process. He's in his mid to late 30s. He's not a guy who is particularly experienced when it comes to leading a group. Even as the offensive coordinator in Philly, he was only the offensive coordinator for like a year and a half. When Nick Sirianni took over, he was the play caller, and then Shane took over and they started doing really well. And so I think that limited sample size when compared to Frank Reich's NFL odyssey is not as appealing, maybe on paper, to a newish owner who had to deal with somebody who was an amateur when it came to the NFL.
Mike Kay, Charlotte Observer, covers the Carolina Panthers. You mentioned Scott Fitterer, and we'll close on this. I think it was, I'm trying to remember the reporter who asked about, maybe it was Sheena who asked about the laser eyes making an appearance as we get ready for the start of the season. With this 53-man cut, I think you've speculated about this as well, potential to make a move, maybe add somebody on the offensive line. Maybe they just wait for guys to get cut. They pick some people up on waivers. What do you expect the Panthers to do to add on this roster based on what we've seen so far?
They'll be very busy towards the bottom of the roster. There is no question about it. I think you could see 3 to 4 waiver claims. They are 9th in the pecking order, so they have 8 teams in front of them. So they're not going to get every guy they want. Most likely, while they think they're going to get a really nice first bite at the apple, as Dan Morgan said, I mean, there are 8 teams that have needs as well. And remember the Bears, who seemingly are running a franchise that's just like playing Madden, might have the opportunity to gain a couple of guys. So what I would say is, look, they're going to call around. I mean, they have to.
Yeah.
They do. What Dan Morgan said is completely accurate to what I've heard. They want to keep their draft picks. I mean, they did just trade a haul for Bryce Young. So to select Bryce Young, I should say. And so I think you'll see some player for player interest. I'm really intrigued to see what happens to the Matt Rule draft picks that Scott Fitter had a part in. I've left Brendan Smith and Shi Smith off my 53 pretty much all summer. We saw what happened with Bravion Roy. We've, speculated about Matt Corral. There's a lot of movement that could happen at the back end of the depth chart. And frankly, I'm really, I put this out today about a rules scenario about vested veterans. Remember, you can cut a vested veteran, bring him back in week 2 and not guarantee his contract. So guys like Eric Rowe and Justin McCray and Cam Irving, those guys are susceptible to potentially being cut and then being brought back. And so I think they could go very young on the offensive line depth, whether that's keeping guys on the 53 who are undrafted rookies or practice squad holdovers, or claiming guys off of waivers who are in their first or second year. I think this team knows what it is, which is a 2-year rebuild. And I think the preseason kind of alluded to that. They are very top heavy. They don't have a ton of depth, and they really need to upgrade certain spots, specifically wide receiver and cornerback, and the offensive line. I think defensive line, if they were to make a trade, would be one of the target positions for them.
Gilia was making a face when you brought up Matt Corral.
I forgot they changed the rules, though, the roster rules on that third quarterback, haven't they?
Yeah, so essentially what happens is on the game day roster, you obviously get your normal 46 players, but you can dress a 47th who's the third quarterback, but he has to be on your 53-man roster. He cannot be a call-up from the practice squad. So basically you're weighing the fact that you drafted this kid in the 3rd round last year. He wasn't a complete abject disaster in the preseason. And, oh, by the way, you've spent the entire summer trying to develop him in your system. Plus, if all heck breaks loose, I know we were on a podcast, but I just wanted to make sure we were all
fine. You're good.
Then you have Matt Corral, who has the institutional knowledge of the summer to understand what goes on in the offense. I mean, we do know that Andy Dalton's coming off a back injury. We do know that Bryce Young is 5'10", 204 pounds. So, I mean, I don't think it would hurt you. Also, is it worth is it worth dropping him for like a 6th cornerback or,
yeah,
that's
Walker's available again.
I mean, come on. You're talking Will Greer and Jimmy Clausen territory here.
Look, it didn't work.
It's over.
It didn't work, man.
It's a wrap.
Look, I tweeted this earlier. Sam Ehlinger, who they drafted in Indy, who got to start, who I don't think is better than Matt Corral, but maybe you say to yourself, "Hey, I want my guy." I mean,
I think you hit the nail on the head there with the rule guys, and
makes sense. Mike K. Hey, man, we appreciate it. As always, go check out Processing Blue, the Panthers podcast over at the Charlotte Observer. We'll talk to you later.
Sounds good.